All right, all good morning and welcome back to our Totem Top 10 series. This is our basic cybersecurity hygiene series where we walk through 10 individual cybersecurity safeguards and discuss really in detail what meaning they have for your organization. We are continuing to move our way along. And before I jump into the presentation, I want to give folks a couple minutes to sort of trickle in here. I wanted to share something that I saw earlier in the week that's super relevant. So if you're like me on Sunday, you were probably watching the Super Bowl, and it was a pretty good game, except for that a division rival ended up winning that game. So I wasn't exactly rooting for the Rams, but okay. In the theme of football and also sort of what we talked about in our introduction last week, something pretty crazy happened during the week. The San Francisco 49ers, do we have any 49ers fans in here? I hope not, because you guys got pwned. The 49ers were hit by a ransomware attack, and it made the news. So looks like the culprit was a ransomware gang called Blackbite, and they stole some important team documents and then sold them on the dark web. So that's unfortunate. They had disrupted some of the 49ers corporate IT network systems, and so really just a huge pain for them in the end. But what I wanted to point out was that it looks like Blackbite is in fact a ransomware as a service group. When we kicked off our session last week, I introduced the idea or the concept of ransomware as a service. And we talked about some of the implications of such a model for small businesses, for medium-sized businesses, and what this means moving forward. And so it's crazy to see in the news during the week, after we're all sort of in this football mood, that an actual NFL team got hit by a ransomware attack, and the culprit was indeed a ransomware as a service group. What's concerning about this to me is that the fact that like ransomware as a service is even a thing suggests that it's easy for attacks like this to happen, because the tools needed to conduct a ransomware attack are widely accessible and pretty easy to procure. You just go and pay a group like Blackbite, $40 or $60 a month or whatever they're charging. They'll give you the ransomware and you can go attack whoever you please. So they're essentially enabling less experienced attackers to run these sort of attacks. And that's really the glaring weakness here, is that, in fact, I think they mentioned, anyone can use malware to launch the attacks. That is the most concerning part here, because before you had to have a pretty skilled hacker to understand the ins and outs of a network, to understand something in the chat. Does the article say how the gang's malware got into the network that allowed? No, it doesn't go that deep in depth. Somehow they got in, they don't mention, but in the end they were able to plant the malware and infect the systems. But anyways, the most important implication, most concerning fact out of all of this is that anyone can launch the attack. So it doesn't have to just be an experienced hacker doing so. They've made it so that less knowledgeable, less experienced folks can try and do this themselves. Yeah, Adam says, I bet phishing. I'm sure he's absolutely right. Because as I showed last week, like 90% of data breaches of security incidents start with a phishing attack. So yes, very likely that it started with phishing. So Adam, I'm going to assume that means we should be training our users to spot phishing attacks, right? Is that a good conclusion with what you're saying?
There you go, along with the rest of the Totem top 10.
Yeah. Super scary. Another division rival for my team. So I feel bad for them that they allowed this to happen, but man, super unfortunate. But anyways, let's get jumping in. Alrighty. I think we are good to go. Just getting the chat and Q&A pulled up so I can see those. Everything goes crazy once you share your screen. All right. Again, welcome back. Hopefully that gave some time for folks to trickle in. Again, welcome back. This is our Totem Top 10 series. We talk about basic cybersecurity hygiene and specifically 10 of what we have identified to be the most important cybersecurity safeguards to implement to lower your risk. And we've spent a considerable amount of time up to this point discussing really just non-technical topics in nature, like system inventorying and cybersecurity user training. We have delved into technical ideas a little bit, but we haven't really explored any technology up to this point. Well, today we are going to be looking at our very first technology in this series, which is software whitelisting. We're going to spend some time discussing what software whitelisting is, as opposed to other methods for controlling software or maybe other things. We're going to talk about how software whitelisting may fit into your cybersecurity program. How does it actually work? What are some of the terms that maybe you should know? Some of the ideas that are important when it comes to creating a whitelist, maintaining a whitelist. We're also going to attempt, fingers crossed, we're going to attempt a whitelisting demonstration where I'm going to demo a tool that is built into Windows operating systems called AppLocker. AppLocker is a tool native to Windows that will allow us to control the software, to manage the software that is running inside our environment. So it's a neat tool. If you're running a Windows operating system that supports AppLocker, you can fiddle around with it yourself, though I wouldn't recommend you do so unless you know what you're doing. So maybe wait till after the demonstration. So we're going to take a look at that tool. As always, we're going to keep chugging along with our system inventory template. I mentioned that document was going to sort of guide us along as we go. So we'll continue to work our way through that. As always, any questions, stick them in the Q&A or the chat. I will do my best to answer them. Yep, so the slides will be available once we conclude the presentation. Great question. So we won't have that until the end of the Totem Top 10, but if you want to retrieve the recording, I believe you can reach out to Mike. Is that correct, Mike? And you can provide them with the recording. But we'll double check on that and follow back up with you. I'm pretty sure that's the case. All right. Thanks for the questions. Again, stick your questions in the chat and I'll do my best to answer them. If anything comes up outside of the presentation that you want to talk about or you have questions on, feel free to email me. My email is there on the screen, nathan@totem.tech, or you can do it the cool way and connect with me on LinkedIn and we can chat that way. I'm kidding, of course. All right. As always, a quick review before we jump in. One of the obvious sort of glaring weaknesses that we have discussed over and over and over again that exists among small businesses is that we are prime targets for hackers. It's due to a number of reasons, primarily because we tend to be way too overconfident in our cybersecurity. We aren't adequately training our users to identify and prevent things like phishing, such as what was probably the case with the 49ers organization, even though they are a large organization, large or small, we all get hit with phishing attacks. So we need to be training our users to do so. And a significant deficiency exists within small businesses, and that from what we have observed, most of us aren't doing that. And so it makes us a prime target. We've also noticed that our systems tend to not be secure. We may be relying on old or outdated technology or processes as a way to sort of keep us safe. And when in reality, this is sort of a myth that we're believing. It's led to a false sense of security. And we tend to think that we're more secure than we really are. We also talked a lot about how cybersecurity is all about risk management. There are simply way too many threats to deal with, too many vulnerabilities to identify and remediate, that trying to fix all of these things just becomes way too expensive, honestly, for the small business. And so instead of trying to stay on top of every single threat to ever exist, we instead take what is known as a defense in depth approach to cybersecurity, which basically means that we have multiple safeguards working together, layered together, to lower our cybersecurity risk. And our approach to defense in depth starts with the Totem Top 10. And so that's why we are presenting this to you and encouraging the idea of a defense in depth approach. But to sort of measure the effectiveness of the Totem Top 10 as we move along, I demoed in week 1 an actual phishing attempt that we received, seen here on the screen. We talked a lot about what would happen if a user clicked on that invoice.doc attachment, and we concluded some pretty ugly things would happen. And so throughout the course of this series, we're going to talk about how each control could play a part in preventing a phishing attack such as this from being successful. As we discussed last week as well, a trained and aware workforce is your most effective defense when it comes to preventing cyber threats. This is a requirement. This is an absolute necessity. Your users must be trained to be able to identify things such as this phishing attack and other types of threats. We talked about social engineering. An example of social engineering would be phishing. We talked about insider threat. How do you know someone within an organization may be seeking to do harm to that organization? We also talked about building a cybersecurity culture and how ultimately at the end of the day, this is really just a safety culture and what that means. But really sort of the theme of last week was that since your users are your greatest weakness, they become the biggest target for the adversaries. And so because of this, we need to be training them. And with training, we can turn our users from our biggest weakness into our most effective defense. So quick recap of where we are up to this point. I hope you find that helpful. But I'm super excited to actually dive into some technology today. And we're going to try and keep things surface level still, but we are going to get a little under the surface in some areas. So again, feel free to ask questions or take notes or whatever helps you understand more, I guess, in-depth topics. And again, let me know if you have any questions. So this is where we stand so far in our series. Remember that the first 2 controls, we recommend you do these in their respective order. So you know your assets first, and then you train your users. But once you've done this, we honestly think you could do the rest of these in whichever order you see fit. But today we're going to start with whitelist software. So before we dive into the solution, which is software whitelisting, why don't we start by just identifying the problem as a whole? I guess, how vulnerable is software, and why should we even care about securing it? Is there a need to care about securing it? And this is honestly a loaded question, and it does require some context, I think. Software at its core is simply just any set of instructions that tells a computer how to work or what to do. Our computers, our systems have software built into it, also known as firmware, which helps to make it run. But we also, on a daily basis, introduce new software to our machines. Every time we download an application or a program from the internet, we are introducing new software, new code to our machines. And so software is a major component of how we use our computers and honestly just how we do business. And there's nothing wrong with this. Software is an incredibly powerful tool that makes business a lot easier, to be honest. I am depending on several different types of software right now just to give you this presentation. And so without it, we'd be standing, in a room and I'd be writing on a whiteboard or a chalkboard or something. So the technology, the software is great. The problem, in my opinion, is that we tend to assume that just because a piece of software exists or just because it's widely used, that means it's secure. And this is a pretty dangerous assumption. Because again, every time you install a piece of software on your machine, you're introducing new things to your machine that it may have not seen before. New processes. In addition to new processes, you're also introducing new security flaws, new weaknesses or vulnerabilities that come with that piece of software. And in many cases, when these weaknesses are exploited by an adversary, they can be used to extend beyond just the scope of your machine. In fact, an adversary typically will use outdated software as sort of their stepping stone to get into your larger, greater network. So outdated software, insecure or rather unsecure software is a significant weakness and a significant risk to have on our machines. And it is something that hackers love to use to wreak havoc upon all of us. I included on this slide here the top 10 most critical security concerns when it comes to web application or software vulnerabilities. This is released by a pretty well-respected organization, the Open Web Application Security Project, or OWASP. This is a great resource to stay up to date with when it comes to major software vulnerabilities. And the Totem Top 10 is not going to address all of these deficiencies, which is why ultimately it's important that your cybersecurity efforts extend beyond just what we discussed during this series. But these vulnerabilities have been identified as the most prevalent, and so we need to be able to protect ourselves from these, because this is what attackers are using again as sort of their stepping stone to reach their bigger, greater target, which may be something like your file server, or so that they can encrypt it and then plant their ransomware or whatever. And so we need to be aware of the vulnerabilities that exist within software. So as a whole, to answer this question, how vulnerable is software? I would say it is quite vulnerable. We should see software as a significant security risk to our organization, and we need to understand the risk associated with introducing new software to our environment. And so this ultimately gives us a reason, I think, to conclude that software is absolutely something that we must be controlling in our environment. We cannot allow anything and everything to be installed, whatever our users want. We have to take a more reasonable, risk-minded approach to this. And this is where something such as software whitelisting comes into play. The term whitelisting means, at its most basic level, just simply means to deny by default and then choose what to allow. This is the exact opposite of blacklisting, which may be a more familiar term to most people. But blacklisting meaning, of course, to allow by default, and then you choose what to deny. One of the examples of this that helps me to remember what these mean is a wedding. A wedding in and of itself is probably a limited and a controlled environment, meaning that only those who are supposed to be there are there. If you've ever had the opportunity to plan a wedding, or if you've talked with people who are planning a wedding, you probably don't make the wedding open to anyone and everyone. And then you send out letters to people, to those who you don't want to attend. Like that'd be a lot to manage, first off, because how are you going to send letters to everyone you don't want to attend? And you're going to make a lot of people mad. This is sort of akin to blacklisting, where you are saying everyone can come except for these people, and I've identified these people I don't want to attend my wedding. On the other hand, whitelisting would be, I'm not going to say anyone and everyone can attend my wedding. I'm going to specifically choose who I want to attend, and I'm going to send them an invitation. Right? This is the more, I think, reasonable approach to planning a wedding, and it helps keep things way under control, way easier. And so it's a silly example, but it helps me to sort of picture them and to picture whitelisting as an effective tool as well, because I think blacklisting gets all the love, and we don't really realize how effective whitelisting is. So that's my silly example. In the context of software specifically, when you are creating a software whitelist, you are specifying exactly the types of software, exactly the applications themselves that you want to allow to run in your environment. And everything else, if it's not on the whitelist, is going to be denied by default. So when it comes to blacklisting, you are saying anything and everything can run in our environment, all of the software, except for this program, which we have identified as bad, this program, which we have identified as bad. Thanks, Adam. Yeah. Hopefully that helps reinforce this idea of whitelisting. But anyways, remember a couple of weeks ago when we were working through our system inventory example, we got to the software baseline sheet, and where we went through and we identified this is the software that we want to allow to run in our environment. Well, this software whitelisting is how we're actually going to enforce that baseline. Putting a list together on a spreadsheet is good, but it's not until we introduce some sort of technology that we can actually enforce that policy or enforce whatever we're trying to accomplish. And in this case, software whitelisting will help enforce the software baseline we have identified. So hopefully you can see why we started with know your assets, because first we need to identify, well, what software do we approve to run? And that itself is a pretty extensive conversation, but once you've made it past that point, you make it here, you're ready to introduce some technology to actually implement that baseline. So hopefully you can see that software whitelisting is an extremely powerful technology, because it effectively gives you complete control over what your users run. Like the wedding, If you are taking the whitelisting approach and only sending out invites to people you want, you have complete control over who attends your wedding. If it's not on the whitelist, if it's software or a person not on the whitelist, it's denied by default. Whereas with blacklisting, you have to actually identify every single piece of software, every single program, in the case of the wedding, every single person you do not want to attend. And this is incredibly difficult to manage and honestly an impossible task. Just take the risk approach. Something is going to slip through eventually. And so with whitelisting, we are casting a really wide net and giving ourselves the buffer that we need to protect ourselves. And so this, along with other controls in our Totem Top 10, is really going to help strengthen our defense in depth. But just take away from this that software whitelisting is arguably the most powerful technology in this list. If not the most, then definitely one of the most powerful. And so definitely something you should be considering to implement in your own environment. So let's talk a little bit about how whitelisting itself works. I've given a very, very basic generic overview of how software whitelisting works, but let's get a little more technical if that's okay. Again, if you're feeling overwhelmed, you're not understanding something, please ask questions and I will do my best to explain again. But there are a number of different ways in which you can whitelist. First, in whatever whitelisting tool or program you're working in, you can whitelist a piece of software or a file based on first its file path. You can whitelist according to its name or maybe its size. So for example, with the file path, if an application is stored in like we'll just say it's on your desktop. It shouldn't be installed there, but it is. And that is where the application is living. You can insert the path to that specific file, to that application, insert that into the whitelist. And when you attempt to run that program, it's going to check and say, this user is attempting to run this application, which is stored in this location. It looks like this location has the green check mark. It's been whitelisted. We'll allow the user to run it. Basic example. You can also blacklist it and do the exact opposite and deny access to that application if you want. You could do the same thing with an application name or maybe a file size. So lots of different ways to do this. I want to get some feedback here. Can anyone think of any reasons why whitelisting a piece of software or a file or whatever based on its path, its name, or maybe its size may actually not be a good idea? And I encourage you to type your answer in the chat. Think from the mind of an attacker. If I have successfully gained access to a victim's machine and I'm trying to put a malicious piece of software on it, what might I do to try and get around this type of whitelist that is based on a file path or a name or a size? Can anyone think of any reasons why taking this approach to whitelisting may not be the best idea? Any ideas? Justin, yeah. You could put the malware into the path with a specific name. Exactly, bingo. Virtual fist bump. Thank you for your answer. Yes, you're spot on. My name is John Doe and I'm invited to the wedding that anyone else named John Doe gets into. Exactly. It is pretty easy to simply mimic whatever is approved. So for example, if I have on my whitelist that notepad.exe, the notepad application, is allowed to run, I could create another malicious program, name it notepad.exe, and stick it on the machine. And guess what? The whitelist, if it's only checking the name, it's going to say, yep, looks good, and it's going to allow it to run. Or, like what Justin said, if I say, okay, everything within this folder is allowed to run, well, then the adversary is just simply going to take the malware and they're going to go put it inside that folder. And guess what? It's allowed to run. So there are ways that you can get around these different ways to whitelist. So they may not be the most effective ways. And unfortunately, most people take this approach when whitelisting because it is the easiest, and it is effective, but there are pretty simple ways to get around it. So keep that in mind if you choose to take this approach. But we should be thinking, okay, are there better ways to whitelist? And the answer is yes, there are. First, you can whitelist according to the digital signature of a given application. A digital signature is essentially just like a stamp of approval that is used to essentially prove that an application, a piece of software, whatever, has been created by the one who claims to have created it. It's a legitimate program. Typically, this would be a reliable method. The only issue is that there are many applications and many files out there that have not yet been digitally signed. And so we probably don't want to whitelist according to this method. And also it's just not a good best practice to be running and installing programs that have not yet received one of these digital signatures. So probably not the best. If digital signatures were more prevalent, then we could take that approach, but it's probably a little too risky to rely just on digital signatures for our whitelisting approach. The other option would be to whitelist according to what is known as the cryptographic hash of a given file or piece of software. And a hash is just a unique value that is the output of some mathematical algorithm that is applied to a piece of software or a file or whatever. And where even the slightest change occurs to the file or the software, such as like a name change or an update to the file, the entire hash value changes. And that probably makes zero sense to me just explaining in concept. Let me show you what I mean. Here. So hopefully you can see my desktop right now and my excellent Ring of Power, a huge Lord of the Rings guy. So I'm on my desktop. I'm going to create, for example, just a basic text document. I'm just going to call it rule file. I am now going to gather the hash for this file. I'm going to use a program called 7-Zip. This is a free and open source tool that I recommend you use, and I'm actually going to use the SHA feature. So SHA is a mathematical algorithm that we are going to use to apply a hash to this file. So I'm going to run it. Pops up over here. And here we go. This is the hash for this file. It is a unique value. Now watch this. I'm going to change this file and open it. I'm just going to say hello. So I've added 5 bytes to this file. Minimize that. I'm going to run the hash again. As you can see, the hashes are different and they are completely different. Like they are not similar at all. And that's because any changes that you make to a file is going to completely change the hash value itself. So back to my PowerPoint. All right. So this is one way that we can whitelist, is according to the hash value of a given file. We can add the hash to our whitelist, and instead of checking against the name of a file, the path, the size, the whitelist instead checks against that hash value that we created. Since it is a unique value, it is reliable in terms of knowing that it is a legitimate program. Now, this is the most secure method when it comes to whitelisting. The only downside is that it requires pretty significant managing to get to work. I added 5 bytes of text to that note, and it completely changed the hash. So if the first hash was on my whitelist and I changed the file, that new hash is not going to be on my whitelist. It's not going to recognize the program, and it's going to deny it if it's checking for the hash, right? So this approach is going to require pretty significant managing for your whitelist to actually get it to work. It's sort of a trade-off, honestly, when it comes to security versus convenience. And in this case, if we are looking for the most secure method when it comes to whitelisting, this would be it. Whitelisting according to the hash value of any given program, file, whatever. So NIST 800-167 provides some documentation if you're interested on application whitelisting in detail. So you can go read some of the best practices, industry standards, whatever, on whitelisting if you're interested. They talk all about hashing and whatnot, but we're going to try and keep this as surface level as possible here. So thank you for entertaining my super technical jargon. Let's get back to sort of a high level overview. So I don't have this on the slide, but one thing I did want to mention when it comes to whitelisting is in some whitelisting applications, there are 2 different modes that you can take when whitelisting. So there's an enforcement mode, which essentially means that the whitelist itself is going to enforce whatever rules that you have created. So if I say only allow these applications, if someone tries to run a different application, it's going to enforce my rules and it's going to deny them. There's another mode called audit mode, and I'm going to be demoing both of these here in a minute, which instead of like actually denying the execution of software, it instead will create an alert. It'll create a log warning whoever is managing your organization's event logs, which we're going to talk about with our last control in the series. It's going to alert them what is going on, and they will be able to monitor that potentially malicious activity. So there are 2 different modes when it comes to whitelisting, one that actually enforces and another that simply just alerts. So I wanted to mention that real quick before we get into our whitelisting demonstration. I don't know about you guys, but I'm a visual learner. I could, slides are interesting and everything, but seeing something in action really helps me to understand it. And so I'd like to attempt a demonstration for you all of Windows App Locker. Again, App Locker is a whitelisting or blacklisting, just a software and application control tool that is built into Windows operating systems. Your IT administrators can configure App Locker to work across an entire domain, so across the entire company. So you don't have to, insert these rules on every single machine. You can apply it across an entire group, or you can do it on a single workstation if you want. There are different ways to do it. You can whitelist in App Locker according to the same things that we discussed previously. So that's a quick overview, and it also lives under local security policy, or if you are taking the group approach, group policy management. But anyways, anytime you attempt a live demonstration in front of a bunch of people, you are setting yourself up for catastrophic failure and embarrassment. Thankfully, my colleague Adam has petitioned with the live demo gods on my behalf, and I'm believed to have found favor with them, but ultimately we shall see. Say a prayer if you wish, and we'll see if we can't get this demonstration to work. So let's fire it up. I have here a VMware workstation. If you've never, I've burned incense and sprinkled holy water on the network. Thank you, Adam. If you all could do the same, it'd be much appreciated. Anyways, I'm working in VMware Workstation. This is an awesome tool for engineers to use to run different operating systems than what may be native to the computer you're using. So for example, I could run like different distributions of Linux in here. I could run even like a Mac OS in here. It's a contained virtual environment that allows me to do all sorts of cool stuff. So if you've never seen a virtual machine before, this is what it is, and this is why it looks like I'm in a computer inside a computer, because I basically am. So in this case, I'm using Windows Server 2019. Let's go ahead and open this up. I have 2 accounts created in here. I have an administrator account and I have a basic user account. Just to keep things simple, we're going to use the administrator account, and we're just going to keep things local to try and understand things. Dan, thank you. All been there before, yes. I think this will work, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. So let's fire it up. This is what the desktop looks like. It looks like a standard Windows operating system. By the way, if testing AppLocker before actually implementing it interests you, you can do this exact same thing. You can fire up a virtual machine. You can go grab an ISO image from Windows. They have testing licenses available, and they will supply you with that image to use for a limited amount of time in which you can test and engineer your way through it. So anyways, this is the virtual environment that we're going to be practicing in. You may not be able to see that. Let me see if I can't get this a little bigger. Okay, hopefully that's a little easier on the eyes. Perfect. All right, so the first thing that we need to do is we need to activate a specific service that is required to use AppLocker. It is not enabled by default, so we'll run and do that. It is this application identity. We need to just go ahead and start this service. Okay, it started, that's a good sign. As you can see here, this determines and verifies the identity of an application. Disabling this service will prevent AppLocker from being enforced. So this is a specific Windows service that we need to be enabled for AppLocker to work. That's step 1. We're already off to a good start. So let's now go into AppLocker itself. AppLocker is not, like, you can't just type AppLocker. It's not a standard application. You have to go into these, in this case, local security policy. I mentioned you could also do it in group policy management if your IT department is configuring it across a domain. Since I'm in a virtual environment, I do not have a real domain to connect to, so I'm going to do everything locally. So let's do that. Let's go into local security policy. This is the easiest way to do it. And here we are. And this is going to be weird. All right. AppLocker lives under application control policies. And here we are, AppLocker. It's a little bigger. This is what it looks like. As you can see, AppWalker provides access control for applications. The first thing that we want to do when we get into AppWalker is we want to configure our rule enforcement. I mentioned previously that there were two different modes that you can choose from when it comes to software whitelisting. You can take the approach of enforcing rules, or you can take the approach of auditing rules. As you can see here, we can select either one. In this case, we actually want to enforce the rules. We want to see this thing work. And you can also configure AppLocker to enforce rules for different items. In this case, we're just going to stick to executables, but you can also do Windows installers. You could do scripts. You can do package applications, but we'll keep it simple for now. We'll just do executables. So let's go take a look at our executable rules. There are some default rule sets that you may see in here when you first open it. If you don't, you can create them by right-clicking and saying create default rules. These are what allows us to perform our basic functions, opening specific files, running files as administrator. These rules allow us to do this. If we want to implement a whitelist, we are going to have to manipulate these in some way. I'm going to get to whitelisting in a second, but I'd like to start with an example of blacklisting. So I have my default rules, which is basically saying, okay, if you are a user or an administrator, you can access all files in the program files folder or the Windows folder. Administrators can access all files. Okay, so we're taking that approach of allow everything and deny by default, as blacklisting calls for. Let's say I want to create a rule to deny access. We'll just say for everyone. I could select a specific user. If I've created groups of users, I could identify a group to assign this rule to. We'll just keep it basic. We'll assign it to everyone, including myself. I want to deny access, and I can now choose the condition in which I will be whitelisting. As I mentioned, this first one, the publisher, is according to the digital signature that I mentioned, or I can identify a path, or I can identify a file hash. We'll keep it simple and we'll stick to a path because I think that's the easiest to visualize. But again, these are the conditions that I mentioned earlier that we can choose from. We're going to browse files because the executable we want to blacklist in this case is going to be a Notepad, is a specific individual file. So we're going to go look for that. I know that it lives under the Windows System 32 directory. Let's go find it. I could just search for it, but scrolling is way more fun. There it is, Notepad. Yeah, let's create the rule. All right. Looks like it is enabled. Let's make sure that my rule is enforced. It is. So fingers crossed, Notepad should not let me in. There we go. This app has been blocked by your system administrator because I've created a rule to blacklist it. As you can see, I will delete this rule. I will attempt to access Notepad, and look at that, it lets me in. So that is an example of blacklisting. Let's now begin to identify our whitelist. So if we're building a whitelist, we probably don't want these default rules because these rules are allowing our users to access all the files in these locations. So for the sake of this brief presentation, I'm just going to get rid of these. So there is now nothing here. This is because there are no allow rules. There's nothing specifically stating that I can allow, that I can access anything. I cannot. In fact, I believe if I try and go to Notepad, yep, it's gonna block access because I have not created a specific allow rule to allow me to get to Notepad. So let's do that. Let's begin to build our whitelist. And I'm going to allow access to Notepad for me. I'll identify the path, we'll do the file again. Go back to system 32. Scroll because we love it. And Notepad. This prompt is going to come up. It's going to say, hey, you don't have the default rules. Don't you want those? No. All right. Our allow rule for Notepad is now in place. Let's see if we can get to it. Hey, look at that. There it is. So pretty cool, huh? We just created an allow rule to allow us to get to Notepad. If now, because Notepad is the only thing I've whitelisted, let's say I want to try to get to like command prompt. I can't because it's not in my whitelist. Okay, let's fix that. Let's add command prompt. And we want to allow it based on the path. Command prompt also lives in this directory. Scroll because we love it. Looking for CMD. There it is. Great. So now I should be able to access both of these. Oh, good. Well, that's expected. I thought we almost got there without any errors. Okay, well, typically that would work. And you'd be able to access both command prompt and Notepad. I wonder if I have to refresh this. Let me try that. Yeah, that's interesting. Anyways, that is how you would whitelist a basic example. It is app locker in itself is pretty finicky. It's not known to be the most intuitive tool. The demo gods have struck again, indeed. Well, I'm glad I was able to show at least how Notepad works. Command prompt is being weird, I guess. We'll just get rid of that. But this is a very basic demonstration of whitelisting in action. Hopefully you can see how effective it is, because once you've built your software baseline, inject that into your whitelist and keep that updated over time. It gives you so much control over what is running in your environment. And it helps to keep the bad guys out. So I see we are starting to run short on time, so let's start to wrap this thing up. All right, time to type in the chat, everyone. True or false? A whitelist, wow, that's great grammar, Nathan. A whitelist could have helped protect us from the Hawkeye phishing email. True or false? Type in the chat. What do you think your answer is? Someone be brave and go first. Anyone else? This is your chance for a virtual fist bump. Adam gets one. Okay. Well, Adam is correct. So yes, a whitelist would have been extremely helpful in the event that a user clicked on the invoice.doc attachment after receiving this phishing email, because part of that attachment was if you remember, it reached out and attempted to install the Hawkeye keylogger, attempted to install a specific program that would immediately run and install the keylogger, which would then begin to monitor everything typed into that victim machine, and it would forward that to an external destination. If we had had a properly configured whitelist, that program, that keylogger executable, would not have been allowed to do anything. It would have been stopped right in its tracks because it's not on our whitelist. So yes, Adam, absolutely correct. A whitelist would have been an extremely helpful tool to have at our disposal to assist in preventing against this, because again, the risk management approach, someone is going to click on a phishing email at some point. So we want to be training our users all the time to not do that. But we want to have other safeguards in place layered together to help us, to assist us when it inevitably happens. And in this case, a whitelist is extremely effective in helping with that. So as we start to wrap this up, there are different ways that you can start to fit whitelisting into your own cybersecurity program. We recommend that you do end up picking a whitelisting solution, whether that's a native solution like AppLocker or a third-party solution. With the third-party solution, they're better because you don't have to manage them, but you have to actually make sure that they are managing the product well. Just because they claim that it's an effective tool doesn't mean it actually is. So you want to be a little careful with that. We have a knowledge base on Reddit that you can access. It's called Totem Knowledge Base. We have included some options for Linux users, if there are any here. Various whitelisting solutions. And overall, I think we're seeing whitelisting sort of start to gain popularity. I think people are starting to realize how effective it is. And so we're starting to see more tool options out there, which is encouraging. We've talked a lot about software whitelisting, but software is not the only thing you can whitelist. There are ways you can whitelist like IP addresses or MAC addresses to prevent rogue devices or unauthorized users from accessing your network. You can even whitelist like email addresses, but I don't really know why you would do that. That seems like a lot to manage. But there are other things you can whitelist. Whitelisting is a broad term, and in this case, we are applying it to software. So keep that in mind. And again, ultimately, at the end of this, it's the defense in depth approach that is going to protect us from that Hawkeye keylogger. It's not any one specific technology that we're just going to throw all our money at and rely on. We need lots of different safeguards layered together to protect us. So with that, I think this is a good place to end. I'm thankful that the live demo guides were favorable for the most part. Hopefully you were able to take some cool stuff away from this presentation. It's awesome to be able to get into the technology a little bit. And please join us next week for our discussion on patching and why an outdated or old software system, whatever, is a huge risk, and some things you can do to mitigate that. So happy to answer any questions if there are any, but I think we're good to close this thing out. Any questions? Feel free to reach out to me or to Totem Tech if you have any questions. We're here to help you. We want to be a resource for you, as I've said every week. So appreciate you all tuning in. I will hang around for questions a little bit longer, but I don't see any. So take care, everyone, and we'll see you next week.